So this would be a mock lesson I would teach on Arthurian legend, Tales of Camelot for an English 2 course. To start off with, I would go over the standards and the objectives with my students. One of the things I like to do is to go over the standards with my students on the screen and then have them develop I will statements so that they know what they can develop and be able to do by the end of the lesson. In this case, the standards are developed, determine a theme or central idea of a text, and analyze in detail its development over the course of a text, including how it emerges in shape, and refined by specific details, provide an objective summary of the text. Also, they will be able to analyze how complex characters, like those with multiples or conflicting motivations, develop over the course of a text or interact with other characters and advance the plot or develop the theme. And again, I would have them write these out and I will be able to statements. That way they will be able to track their learning. To start off the lesson, what I would do is I would present words for them to create a word map showing relationships between the words. And these would be activating their prior knowledge from nobility or feudalism. So these would be words that we had previously gone over or touched on in class in some way, like queens, castles, kings, nobles, swords, love, specifically courtly love, medieval, peasants. And so I would have students create a word map to see how they could connect these words and see how they could put these together in their thinking and organizing their ideas and thoughts. This would allow me to see what my students already know in comparison to what they will need to know for Lord Tennyson's poem that we will be going over today. So in order to introduce the poem, The Lady of Shalott by Lord Alfred Tennyson, I would want to talk about mood. And so in order to do that, I find that images are one of the most effective ways to discuss mood in the classroom. So to discuss mood in literature, I like to start with images. And in this case, what I did is I took an image and I broke it down into 6 subsections. In these 6 subsections, what I would do is I would have my students label their paper 1 through 6, and I would reveal each section one at a time and have them write down words that elicit the mood that they see for each section. So, for example, the first section shows a skyline of trees and mountains in the background. And I would have students write down what type of mood they may feel from looking at this subsection of the picture. So they may write down words like calm. They may write down words like picturesque. They may write down words like imaginative, or they may get away from mood words. They may write down pretty or nice. And so what I would want for them to do is kind of get back to the idea of mood and how it makes us feel. And so what I would do is really elicit those emotional type words. And I could do this by even providing my students with a list of mood or tone type words that would help them better develop those senses. I would cover each picture back up as I go to the next subsection. For the second subsection, I would have students look at the bow of the boat and look at the carving specifically and the candles with the dripping wax with the elaborate blankets that are hanging off the sides of the boat and see what type of mood or emotions they may feel from this section of the picture. From the third section of the picture, I would have the students look at the water with the lilies floating on the water and have them elicit their moods on paper and what type of things they are feeling. Now, at this point, since we're halfway through the photo and looking at mood, I would ask for some verbal feedback here. And so I would want for them to kind of look at the first 3 subsections of the photo and what they have written down so far and have them kind of start to look at what they may think this photo as a whole may elicit as a mood for them. Then we would move on to the 4th section of the photo, which again is a more elaborate carving of the boat, and it looks like the blanket has more images and pictures, and these elicit more colors. And so I'd want to know what they feel looking at this section of the photo. I'd move on to the fifth section and show them what looks to be like a little bit more of a chaotic section of the photo and what they may find that they feel from looking at this section and how it may change in looking at this. Now, because we are moving from the smaller subsections to the largest subsection, I would really tell the students that I want for them to really focus on this sixth subsection, and I'd want for them to come to an overarching mood that they may find. Now, in this section of the photo, we have the obvious face of a damsel in distress, and I would want to know what moods are emoted through her face and from looking at the background even of this photo. So it's more dark in the background with the darker trees, and the forest is dense. And from looking at her face and how she is emoting her own emotions, what type of emotions or mood might we feel from this photo? Once students have gone through all 6 of the sections, I would darken them out, and I would ask them to try and write out a mood word that describes it as a whole. Then I would move on to the picture as a whole. I would ask the students to look at the image as a whole, and I'd like for them to write about how they feel about the image altogether. Now, because this is not broken down anymore, they can see it as a whole. I'd like for them to write about the mood as a whole, and I'd like for them to just write about the image as a whole. What do they think the young woman is doing? Why do they think she is in the boat? Why do they think she has candles there? Why do they think it looks chaotic in the far left corner of the picture? What do they think is her purpose of being in the boat? There are several different questions that I could ask to prompt their writing, but I would like to know what they think encompasses the entire picture. And I would like to lead them into the conversation of what a romance is, especially that of a medieval romance. Now, hopefully at this point, my students would have a background knowledge on medieval literature and what medieval courtly love would be. But I would like to go into a little bit more detail about characteristics of a romance with some notes on the next slide. So for characteristics of a romance, I'd like to talk to my students about how they are idealized noble characters, especially like the idealized young woman we just saw in the last photo. She is a damsel in distress, obviously, and obviously she is very beautiful. We can tell that maybe she is rich from her clothes. We can tell that she has some sort of nobility because of her stature and the way she is sitting in the boat. And we know that she has some sort of noble characteristics about her. Other characteristics of a romance would be exaggerated behavior. So it seems to be exaggerated the way she is sitting in the boat and the way she is leaned forward and progressing towards something, but we just cannot see what it is further than what the picture suggests. Another example or characteristic of a romance might be a hero's quest. The most famous hero's quest, of course, being the quest for the Holy Grail in medieval literature. Another characteristic of a romance might be supernatural or magical elements, like that of magic or sorcery, or that of dragons or supernatural animals. There may be unusual or exotic settings, or unusual or exotic animals that we may meet, or unusual or exotic characters. We may also find incidences involving hidden or mistaken identity. And so these are all characteristics of a romance that I'd like for my students to be familiar with, just as general background notes, so that they would be familiar with these before we get into the reading of Lord Alfred Tennyson's poem, Now, then the students would go into listening to The Lady of Shalott by Laura McKennett, and I would have them highlight imagery and light and underline imagery of sky, especially in part 3, because they would certainly see it there. And this would be up to each individual student to do. I would allow them to take their time on this, of course, especially if they wanted to go back and re-listen to any specific portion. Now, I do have it linked here so they could listen to it here and we could listen to it as a class, or they could go back and listen to it individually. And I would provide a copy for each student. They could do this electronically or they could do this on a hard copy. But this would allow for each of my students to work. And this would allow me to differentiate my lesson. And so my students would be able to really work on their own terms. And this would allow me to see what they are capable of and to work with them on their level. Now, at this point, I could even pull out small groups and work with them on small groups to look at highlighting the imagery and really focusing on, well, what is imagery and how do we identify it? Now, I do have some examples of this, and I could show my students how they could see this. And I could go over this in class with them. Now, I would want to make sure that in going over this in class, that I go over some positive examples of light and imagery, of course, and that I look at imagery of the sky. And I would also want to make sure that I go over a little bit of background information. So, of course, this is based on an Arthurian maiden, Elaine of Astolat, who fell in love with Lancelot but was rejected because of his love of Guinevere. It's said she died of a broken heart, and her family set her body adrift in a small barge on the river that led to Camelot. And so this also goes back to the image that the students reflected on mood. And so I could go back to their original writings on mood, and I could say, okay, if we think of Elaine and we think of how she felt, then in what ways do you think Lancelot might have felt in knowing that he was responsible for this? I could also tie this back to feudalism and the power pyramid. And one way to do this is by reading part 2 of the poem specifically together and having the class identify the different classes that they see within the poem. They can identify the characters introduced within the section. And there are characters introduced within the section from all the different sections of feudalism except for the king and queen. So within the church, we do see the presence of an abbot. To represent the nobility, we do see damsels. To represent knights, we see pages and knights specifically. To represent the merchant class, we see market girls. And to represent the peasants, we see the shepherd lad. So this would represent feudalism, and it would identify the different classes all within one poem. To make this relevant to my students, one thing that I could do is tie this to modern day music, and I could have this tied to the YouTube video If I Die Young by a famous country singing band. And if they watch the video, they can look for allusions to the poem, The Lady of Shalott, and they can see how the young woman drifts on a barge just like Lady Elaine. And they can identify other allusions to the poem within the story. Now, I wouldn't want to personally identify those for them. I would want for the students to share those with me as a class. To wrap up the lesson, I would go through some multiple choice style questions for the class. From the text, what type of archetype might match the Lady of Shalott? What type of feudal class might not be represented in the passerbys? Which of the following would best represent a motif of the Lady of Shalott? Why is the Lady of Shalott cursed? And what is the rhyme scheme of each stanza for the Lord Tennyson and Lady of Shalott? And these multiple choice questions will help my own understanding of my students' understanding and just knowing that they have grasped the concept of the poem and the lesson. Now, in addition to this, I could go back and I would collect the annotations that the students have done from earlier within the lesson where they have looked at imagery specifically, and this would allow me to differentiate my lesson a little bit further. Now, from this point, what I would do is I would grade the annotations. I would grade based on whether or not they have really grasped the annotations of light and sky, and I would grade based on what they highlighted and what they underlined on their imagery. Now, this would allow me to further decide what I needed to pull out for further differentiation groups the next time we look at imagery within poetry.